I think this would be a good time to get started so we don't run too short of time if anyone ends up having very good conversations at the end and feeling cut off. So this session is Designing for Diversity, and I'm Fiona Nowling. I'm the culture lead on the national board of our Open ERG at McKesson, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And just starting off with a little bit of details about McKesson, we're a giant healthcare company. We are in the top 10 largest companies in the US on the Fortune 500 list, and we do almost everything you can imagine for healthcare other than us personally actually coming to your house and treating you. So we have systems that work with doctors, we have systems that work with pharmacists, we have delivery of medication, and we help people even apply for benefits and coverage if their insurance coverage gets refused for their cancer care. Almost anything you can think of, McKesson does. And since I started working here, I always like it when I go to the doctors and I see that the nitrile gloves at the side, so McKesson on the side, because it's almost like being at home or like being at a foreign embassy and having a little touch of familiarity in a sometimes less than welcoming place. So a bit about me. The reason why I'm talking about designing for diversity is that I'm a software engineer. I've been working in IT since 1996, and since 2015, I've been at McKesson. And the piece of work that I do there is I work on a system that decides your benefits when you have a prescription and you go to your pharmacy, and it works out how much that's going to cost for you and whether it clashes with other medications you might be taking. And in my personal life, I also do activism for LGBTQ equality. I run a support group called SOFA, which is for significant others, friends, family, and allies of transgender and non-binary persons. And I also produce some radio shows with my wife at 90.1 FM KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio. We do a show called Trans Talk once a month, which is part of an LGBTQ news and current affairs show and focuses exclusively on trans and non-binary issues. And we do a weekly show that is a feminist show as well. And we've had guests on that are trans women and trans men, and they've discussed how they've seen the gender binary change and shift and how it's highlighted sexism for them. So we cover a wide range of topics. But the aim of the session is to help anyone that's involved in software development or in specifying requirements for bids for vendors for software at their company to make sure that they include diversity in the bid process and help anyone that is interacting with that software. And we're going to try and cover ways to ensure that diverse genders and sexual identities can be included, both for reporting and for self-identification. We're going to look at privacy concerns and also accessibility concerns. And as they said in the abstract originally, we're going to have a presentation where I'm going to talk about some of the requirements and considerations for this, and then we'll break up into active groups where you can discuss in groups the key priorities for you in your personal company, any of the systems that you're interacting with, maybe even in your industry, and whether you can change your industry too. So we have some examples first from healthcare, and then we're going to go on to HR and self-identification concerns, and then we'll have our breakout groups. So the reason I'm picking healthcare and employment is because these issues impact everyone. It can be generalized to other fields such as finance, education, customer service, anything, even just for interacting with your clients and any vendors. So the reason this is important, I'm sure you've already heard in other sessions, but 56% of LGBTQ people have encountered some form of discrimination in healthcare, and 25% of them within the last year. And as of 2017, 19% of transgender persons have been refused healthcare by a physician, and 8% have been physically abused in their doctor's office. which makes designing for inclusion even more vital in healthcare, because good results in healthcare really depend on having a good interaction and relationship with your practitioner. People don't tend to follow advice or take medication regularly if they're not got a certain degree of trust with that person. So establishing that relationship is already working uphill against past trauma and abuse. And even when people intend to be inclusive, they've often got no training, or they only know the CDC statistics on healthcare issues. And so they're going to be told that people that are lesbian or bi or gay or transgender are far more likely to be HIV positive. They're far more likely to have issues with addiction, whether it's alcoholism or drugs, smoking. They're far more likely to be obese, and they're far more likely to be in an abusive relationship. So they will have all those preconceptions, and they might treat you as a statistic and just ask those questions up front. Just like when you are overweight, regardless of what your health issue is, when you go to the doctor, they tend to assume everything wrong with you is just due to obesity and never actually look for actual underlying health concerns. So in order to improve people's healthcare outcomes and just to treat people decently and like real human beings with respect, we need to design for diversity. And employment intrinsically ties into this, because healthcare in the US is tied to your employment, because so many people get their insurance coverage through work. And on the employment side, transgender employees tend to have, on average, a much higher education level and more interest in their work than the average employee, but they tend to have double the unemployment rate of the general population. And that statistic was pre-COVID. So with the crash of the economy since then, it's probable that that statistic is worse now. And 7% of transgender persons have reported being physically assaulted at work. So slightly less than at the doctor's office, but still not a good statistic. But on the opposite side of that, transgender employees that are supported at work are highly loyal. They tend to stay at the company for 9.3 years, which is almost about double the average duration of an employee to remain at a company. And if you're having problems justifying costs in improving the systems for diversity, that fact can be used for a business case to help you get approval for any extra spend for changes to the systems. But there are additional benefits to people that are outside your target community when you design for diversity. If you allow people to use and input their preferred name, it lets non-LGBTQ people put in their nicknames or preferred names and be more comfortable too. My grandmother hated her first name. She was Lydia May Welsh, and she really hated Lydia. And if she went to a doctor and the doctor called her Lydia, she would instantly have her back up and not be responsive. And there could be issues getting true information about her healthcare needs. So you can also include in any business cases and requirements that this is going to provide additional benefits, and not just targeting perhaps 1/10 of the population with any changes that you make. And things like including pronouns on email signatures, it allows people from outside your culture to be able to address you correctly and not be uncomfortable and worry about whether they're misgendering you. You're not assuming your culture has priority and that everyone has to know that the name, for instance, Robin, means that you're male or female. And for that matter, I grew up in England, and generally over there it tends to be a male name, whereas in the US it tends to be a female name. So putting pronouns on your email signatures makes things much more comfortable for everyone and doesn't just ensure a sense of cultural supremacy. And gender neutral language studies have found tends to reduce discrimination not just against LGBTQ people, but also against women. And lastly, name changes historically were tended to only be allowed for last names and only for women. If you make name changes more inclusive and easier in your systems, it makes things easier for perhaps children being adopted or for same-sex marriage name changes. And one thing is that why I'm having this session now is because the first company that asks for these changes will probably get told by the vendor that either they can't do it or it will cost extra money. If enough companies, and particularly large companies, ask for these changes, the vendors will start having to provide it at cost, just as a normal cost of doing business, because otherwise they won't be able to compete because their competitors will be providing it. We can make changes at a grassroots from levels like this, working with our companies. So going into healthcare, most healthcare systems tend to only allow the entry of male or female as a gender marker. Even if the healthcare practitioner system lets you add extra identities, it's possible that the pharmacy system only allows you to enter male or female. A trans woman I know transferred her estrogen prescription to a different pharmacy because it was closer and more convenient to pick it up. Exactly the same insurance company. It went from being $10 a month to being $100 a month for the prescription. And she transferred it back to the original pharmacy thinking that would fix things, and somehow it didn't change the price back. It took 3 days of talking to both sets of pharmacies and then having a call between her and both pharmacies and her insurance company to work out that after she transferred her prescription, the new pharmacy had put her gender marker in as female because that was how she reported it, and her documentation had been changed by then. And therefore it flagged as a not covered item because that level of dosage of estrogen for a cisgender woman would be considered not necessary for healthcare, or maybe even a vanity anti-aging prescription, perhaps to make people's skin softer. And so they would be expected to pay for it out of pocket. But your average consumer of healthcare doesn't have 3 days plus 3 hours to spend on the phone fighting with all the systems to find this out. They might give up. And so when I started working at McKesson, I already knew that story, and I saw that in our benefit system, the older records were flagged with M or F, but the newer ones were flagged with a 0 or 1 instead. So I went to my manager and I said, maybe we should expand the 0 and 1 and allow 2s and 3s and 4s for transgender women and transgender men and non-binary and any other options, so we could avoid issues with things like that, and people could actually have things checked to see whether they're safe for them. And he actually told me that the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, which is always called the NCPDP, they'd already approved a change in the system to allow that to happen. So we weren't going to do one personally ourselves because it might clash with theirs, and we would have to make sure that we got the data right. But I actually went and looked up that change and found that they actually have a gender transition task force reviewing the impacts of transition on people's health records and prescription approval, and making recommendations for pharmacy systems to avoid issues like that happening in the future. So you can make changes in your industry if you just suggest them and know the right people to suggest them to. So you should make sure that your system actually enables gender marker changes. And one thing that people often forget is you should ensure that if you update and improve your system, you make the changes available to everyone, not just new people. A lot of the time, a company adds a new field or an ability, and anyone who was already in the system still gets stuck like that. But you can design systems to flag for a data update next time someone logs in. You get it anytime you use your Apple phone and you update the iOS, and it wants you to check the new and updated terms and conditions and won't let you log in or do anything till you've approved them. So you can do exactly the same thing when you add abilities like this. This screenshot's from KU Med, which is a local healthcare section of a local Kansas university. And it came up a couple of weeks ago when I logged into a patient portal to update my details for what prescriptions I was taking. This screen popped up and asked me to update my gender identity and preferred name, and had it labeled as sex assigned at birth instead of just saying sex or gender. So they had greatly improved and updated their systems, and they'd set it up to make sure it was available to everyone who was already an existing user too, not just new registrants. And when you do update systems and change gender markers, make sure your systems cascade the information onto other systems. You often have interlocking systems that tend to have a dead wall between them, almost like a dead letter drop. They throw some information over the wall and then the other system picks it up, but they can't update each other's data. And one time I went with my wife for an appointment, and when we had made the appointment, we had updated her details and we had changed her gender marker and her name. And when they phoned to remind me about the appointment, they dead named her. And I said, but we spent half an hour on the phone updating gender markers and names with you. And they said, oh, well, we can't actually change the whole system. You also need to talk to. And I had about 3 other people to talk to then. And still, when I went to the appointment with her, they still dead named her when they called her for the appointment. So obviously we didn't spend much time there other than in the waiting room. We left and didn't get treatment at that place. So the other complications with healthcare, you're always going to need a legal name and legal gender marker for billing to insurance or for a national healthcare system, as the records need to match and not get flagged for fraud. And when you have to collect such items, you're going to need to label them considerately. Like the example I showed on the previous screen said sex assigned at birth. You can call them legal name or insurance name or legal gender and insurance gender. Don't just call them name and gender, because that implies that those are the real ones and the other ones are just preferences and not real, and minimizes them and minimizes people's identity. And similarly, if you've got an option on there for providing details about your partner, putting partner or spouse or an option for the gender of your partner is a preferred way to do it. A lot of forms still have options like husband or wife, which can be exclusive. And you need to provide training. It's not just your software systems that need to be updated and designed for diversity. If you have to if you have to check someone's legal ID to make sure that no fraud is happening, people may look at that legal ID and then start referring to the person by the name on the legal ID or the pronouns on the legal ID. So you have to train people to collect the data, but not change the way that they express themselves. And a lot of the time you have to deal with the fact in the systems that many transgender and non-binary persons are concerned about changing their gender marker. They're concerned that if they do that, necessary healthcare stops. I know several trans men who have told me they're not going to change their gender marker with their providers because they're concerned that they'll no longer get covered for their annual mammograms or for treatment if they need something that is found during those annual mammograms. And I also know transgender people who are concerned that if they change their gender marker, their healthcare system will think that they are done, that they no longer need to cover any transition-related healthcare, such as hormone therapy or surgeries. So they're reluctant to change their gender markers for that reason too. So healthcare practitioners have a responsibility to make sure that they explain to the patients that treatment for things is based on these things called IDC-10 codes. And those are a ridiculously complicated system of coding why someone needed that treatment. They even have ridiculously detailed items in there of things like accident with a speedboat, second encounter. And that meant someone had an accident with a speedboat and this is their follow-up checkup. And there are codes as well for if this is related to someone transitioning. Say it's hormone treatment. It could be coded for this is needed for gender transition. Or it could be coded for this person has endometriosis and PCOS and needs hormones to handle that. And based on those codes, the insurance company decides whether that is covered care or not. It doesn't go by what your gender marker is with the insurance company or on your birth certificate. So it's important that people are trained to explain this to their patients to ensure that they feel comfortable making those changes so that they can be treated with the most respect and not force themselves to be dead named and dead pronouned each time they have to talk to their insurance company. And continuous improvement is really important in systems. And we're always improving our understanding of gender and preferred pronouns. The list of those continually expands. So you should definitely make sure that you regularly review best practices, but also add a free form entry, free text field for a preferred gender or pronoun that wasn't already on your list in the system. And if you do add a free text field, don't just label it as other, because if people see other, they often feel like they're being lumped in and left over and just shoved aside. You're the other, you're the leftovers, we didn't really think about you. Make sure that you label it sensitively. And if you're adding that free text field, make sure you have a system in place that monitors the entries in there. And if 9 out of 10 entries in there are always the same item, that's a sign that needs to go onto your main list. You might have a different cutoff at your company, but the most commonly entered and missed items need to be added to the regular list. And I'm often asked by friends, since I run a support group, how they should find a good counselor or therapist. And I always tell them, don't just go by whether the insurance company's list of therapists has a tick box checked for LGBTQ friendly. It's very easy for a practitioner just to tick that and have no expertise or knowledge and actually not be friendly and not be a good experience for you. I tell them, go out to the person's website and check and see if they actually put pronouns on their website, on their bios and details, because that's a good sign that they actually understand things about the LGBTQ community and have made an effort to interact and to demonstrate that and to make that practice a normal practice. It's fairly rare to see, but that website's one of the first things people see about your company, and it's really easy and cheap to do as a change. And it makes a huge difference in putting people at ease. So then the next strand I was going to look at is employment, so health, HR, and self-identification considerations. And a lot of companies ask people to self-identify, both for the expression of the employee so they can bring their whole self to work, but they also collect it for data to monitor the effectiveness of diversity programs, or for statistics to be able to use when people are applying for federal contracts or for other companies' bids that need them to list their racial diversity, their ex-military representation, their LGBTQIA percentages. But it can also be used for internal monitoring to try and improve workforce diversity improvement. And I'm going to come back to that point. But if you're going to do this, you need to do it in a way that doesn't alienate the very population you're trying to empower and to enable. You need to have a good complete list of pronouns to choose from, and a good complete list of genders and sexualities to choose from. Some quite large software vendors only have male, female, or other do not wish to say. And Workday is a really large vendor that is in this field, and they only have those options. And given what I was saying about other can feel othering and alienating, that's really not good phrasing. And the fact that any gender identity that isn't male or female is lumped into that can feel exceedingly alienating for anyone who does not identify as cisgender male or cisgender female. In addition, like I was saying with the healthcare options, have a free text field available and label it sensitively, and continuous improvement. Again, regularly update your main list of choices from best practices and from the most chosen options in that free text field. And make sure if you're doing options for sexuality that when you're doing LGB, that you do actually remember to do B, and don't erase bi or pan or omnisexual people, and give them options like that. Not everyone that's bisexual will also put down that they're pansexual or omnisexual, and vice versa. So make sure people have options that suit their identity. And for this identification, privacy should be in the control of the employee. Depending on the reason you're collecting data, you might only need aggregate data for statistics, in which case HR in aggregate should be the only people that should see that data. And then the employee should know that that is how the data is being treated. If you have the data set up so that it looks like everyone in the whole company can see it, if someone is transgender and is not yet out, they're not going to tick that they're transgender, and you're not going to capture the data and know you really have that many transgender employees. And I mentioned Workday before, which is what our company has. Our HR and our diversity and inclusion groups are working to get those improved and to get the privacy changes made. Because at the moment, anyone in the company can go in and you can search on there, and you can search and say, I want to see all females in Iowa. Or you can or the third group, I want to see everyone that is in that third group of other or chose not to say. And we've got about 10,000 employees, and there's only about 250 people that chose to use that for their gender. So that would be very easy to out people. It's intended to be used so if a group wants to hire internally and wants to improve their gender diversity or the representation, they can use that to try and find people specifically to reach out for and ask them if they want to have a temporary position or apply for a position. But you can use that to exclude people and to out people. So be very careful when you're making decisions about privacy and how to implement them. I would personally recommend having a checkbox that says, I don't mind other people seeing this data. And then they would show up on the list with the gender identity that they have chosen. But if they check the box and say, no, I want to stay private, only use this in aggregate, that won't share their gender identity. Or it would share a cover story gender identity that they have picked. And another complication for HR is that just like with healthcare, you're always going to need to see someone's legal name. In this case, for Social Security and tax reporting, or for checking that they're legally able to work in the country that you're in. And when collecting such items, just like the healthcare item, label them considerately. I've put exactly the same quote in there, basically. Do not just say name and gender, and then the other one be preferred name and preferred gender, because you make it sound like it isn't real. And again, you need to provide training to the staff that handle that information to make sure that they don't start switching names and switching pronouns once they see those details. And the biggest impact for HR is transition services. And many of the major software requirements for this about pronouns and gender identities were covered in the self-identity piece and in healthcare, but processes we haven't talked about very much, and processes are really important too. So things like having a document that provides guidance to employees interested in transition that is easily and privately available, that they don't have to go to their manager or to HR and ask for. It should be easy to find on the company intranet or in the company benefits package. And likewise, having documents easily findable for managers and for HR on how to handle employees transitioning at work. And these documents should be regularly checked to make sure they're still following the best practices. They often end up like a fly stuck in amber. They get fossilized and they're never reviewed and they're out of date. So many of them do not use gender neutral language. They don't cover non-binary and gender fluid people. They should be updated regularly. One of the trans people I know who transitioned at work told me that her HR said to her that when she transitioned, she needed to start using the new restroom on that day, and that she couldn't go back to the old restroom just because it was a shorter walk. She couldn't flip-flop and change between them just because she felt like it. And she was appalled because she would never, and she desperately didn't want to be using the wrong gender restroom anyway. But unless training is provided to managers and HR for people that are gender fluid and non-binary, they're going to get told things like that and still end up feeling othered and alienated, even after they've gone to the effort of coming out at work and trying to transition to be treated fairly. So always review your processes and update them regularly. And name changes in email systems at work need to be handled very carefully. You obviously don't want to risk losing emails coming in, so you can't just delete the old email address. Most companies tend to rename the original account and create an alias, but the alias for the old name can be seen in Outlook if you're inside the company. On the bottom right, I've got a screenshot from my details at my company, and there's two blank lines that say SMTP that actually had internal company information in it. But when people have changed their names, perhaps because they got married or because they transitioned, that SMTP line contains their old name and identity in there, which can out people, which can be a risk to their safety and their comfort at work, or just nasty for them when they go and look at the details and they see that name being flaunted and thrown in their face. So if you do the item with an alias like that, you can set them to expire after a certain time and make sure that they get deleted out of the system so they're no longer seen. And make sure that these get done automatically. Try not to consider that you should do that manually, because if you do it manually, someone is going to forget and it's going to be sitting there, and then the person involved has to contact HR and possibly HR and 3 different sets of the systems people at work, and spend that time and have to out herself to multiple people to get that to happen. My wife, when she transitioned, had to change her name and gender in more than 70 systems at work, and it took 5 years for the last one to finally get done, just because the systems and the way they were updated was that draconian and hard to change. You can also create a new account and set the old one to auto forward to it, and then you don't have a risk of the alias getting left behind and outing people. But you might have legal implications there and need to keep the old email account viable in the system and stored in case you have legal discovery requests. And I already implied this before on the previous page with the email bits, but you should be a one-stop shop for transitioning employees. You're the experts in your systems. It should not be up to each transitioning employee to work out for themselves, all that time being wasted each time for each person, which of the 15 or 100 people they need to contact to update their data. My wife, as well as her number that she had to update at work, she had to update her name and gender marker in over 200 places. So HR may actually choose to make a list of a starter list for people of these are likely places that you might need to update things that they can issue to people to help them with their transition. And if your company has a standard email template that recommends that you put your job title and your address and contact details and perhaps a company logo in it, they should include pronouns in the standard email template for all employees to use, so that it's not just the transgender and gender non-binary employees that do that, to make it normalized so people don't stick out. And I'm going to go fairly quickly on the next few because it's about 4 or 5 and I want some time for the breakout groups to have time to discuss things. But representation matters. A lot of times companies remember diversity in outward-facing literature and marketing. We saw the Outie Award for LGBTQ inclusive marketing. A lot of the time they forget it internally though. Often annual enrollment benefit brochures only show cis heteronormative families in there. They don't show any LGBTQ inclusion in there. And it can give some benefits to cisgender families as well, because having a picture that shows perhaps a father and a child on their own helps normalize people who are divorced and or who have adopted and they are a single parent family for whatever reason. then they don't feel as excluded. So it doesn't just benefit the LGBTQ community. And we should remember all these points for recruitment systems too. And there are actually some recruitment systems that are designed to totally anonymize resumes. So you can't work out someone's race and gender from, say, items like the name field or from the address, because in a lot of cities in the US, certain addresses are more likely to be held by persons of color because of the redlining practices. And so some recruitment systems hide these entirely, so you don't end up with subconscious biases against people. And last, before we go into breakout sessions, intersectionality. You should also think about disability access in system design. For instance, you could consider the colors of text used and the amount of contrast and the ability of users to change them. This slide I've done in Comic Sans MS font, which is not the recommended one from Out and Equal, but it's also often a font that's easier for people with dyslexia to read. But a lot of people mock Comic Sans online because it's cartoonish and childish. But there are some fonts that are easier for people with dyslexia to read, and you can set up your system so that your users can actually change the font that they're using. And if you're going to make changes to your system, make sure that your impacted communities are consulted and that you use and pay sensitivity readers to review changes. Don't just say, oh, well, you're the one transgender person at our company, can you review this? And not give them overtime to do it and tokenize them. Make sure that they know that you value their comfort and either pay them it for overtime or hire external sensitivity readers that have expertise in that area to make sure that the changes are fair and valid. So we'd like to go into breakout groups now, and we're going to aim to go into small groups, and things I thought for discussion might be useful would be to consider which requirements are most critical at your company and in your industry, whether there's items that are highest priority for you to focus on tackling first, because if you try and change everything at once, you will get exhausted. And we've heard a lot about healthcare and mental health and self-care, and we don't want burnout. So you could start to make a list to discuss with your HR diversity and inclusion representatives about changes that you'd like to see. And you could also consider if there's anything you can do to affect change within your industry, not just your company, like my example with the NCPVP prescription changes. So we'll be coming around to the individual groups and assisting or finding the chat, and then about 5 minutes before the end of the session, we'll bring everyone back into the main group so people can provide some feedback from their discussions and any important points that they think they'd like to share. Thank you. I hope everyone had productive chats in their individual breakout groups. Does anyone want to feedback, or does anyone have any questions for me? If you do want to feedback, you'll have to unmute yourself, of course.
Hi, Fiona. Sorry.
Hi.
Fiona, just a quick question. You know, I was just listening to you, talk a little bit about the importance of self-ID and, all the different topics that you covered throughout the session in terms of pronouns, etc. But I had a question in terms of implementation. Where I work right now, we're pre-implementing self-ID. We're excited about it. We're just finished all the different legal, backstage processes before we launch. But of course, we do have a communications campaign where the HR head will be sending, inviting people to self-ID, where we have the CEOs from different countries, also encouraging employees to do so, etc. But I was wondering if you have any suggestions or key ways in which we can invite our employees to participate. Before the self-ID, we did have an internal survey, like a satisfaction survey or engagement survey, really, where people can self-ID anonymously. But now, of course, the self-ID is not anonymous. And even when it was anonymous, we had a challenge for people to do it. I guess, there's still kind of people are still reluctant to self ID, even if it's anonymous. So I was wondering if you have any ideas in terms of how we can, make our employees feel comfortable self IDing, and of course we communicate the importance of having that data to be able to have concrete strategies, etc. But it would be nice to hear a little bit on, implementation ideas.
Part of this depends on how not anonymous it is. Is it that some people in HR can see that data, but not the whole company? Or will every single person in the company, when they go and look at that person's profile on their intranet or in their email, will see that that person chose pronouns of ze, here, or that they chose to put themselves down as gender fluid? Because that makes a big difference in people's willingness to share information. If it's only going to be seen by a few HR professionals for gathering statistics, then you should share that that's all the only people that are going to be seeing that. And that perhaps even people's own managers will not be seeing the data. So they should, to encourage them to feel comfortable to share it.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. And yeah, in our case, it's definitely only for HR, and the only purpose is to be able to understand where we stand and where we have to focus. That's really the purpose of having that info.
Yeah, and in our breakout group, one of the people in there pointed out that their company also does male, female, and other, and that's because of the way that the government mandates reporting for statistics. So if you have to only put it down as male, female, other, it's a good idea to say, we know that there are more identities than this, and we value all of your identities, but for government reporting, we need to do it like this. Or if you provide a larger list of gender identities, you could perhaps group them and say, all of these ones below this line, when we report them for government statistics, will have to go into the other category, but that we value your individual identities and wanted to learn more internally as a company to best support everyone.
Super. Thank you, Fiona.
No problem. Anyone else have any feedback?
One question that I had in terms of when you're using male and female to reference other information that has been collected along those lines. So you're using male to calculate something like retirement age or life expectancy or things like that. Then where the original data collectors weren't collecting data along those lines, would you, and there's no other data source, what is best practice in providing responses for that other option?
For that, you might want to actually list that your data sources are very out of date. And for items such as life expectancy, it's a little bit hard to use those statistics when someone transitions, because often when someone transitions, depending on how early they transition, if you've got them flagged by their birth assigned gender in the system for calculating those statistical actuarial tables, that might not be the life expectancy pattern that they will follow. If someone has transitioned pre-puberty, it's entirely possible that they will fall on the transitioned genders actuarial tables, whereas a lot of systems would just include them in there by their birth assigned gender and would be assuming that they would be dying earlier or living longer than they may perhaps do once they have transitioned. And another aspect is for retirement ages, if your government mandates that males and females retire at different ages, if the government is will probably be going by their legally assigned gender, whether that's whatever has been assigned at birth or whether the government recognizes a gender marker change and it has been changed with them. So for that, you would want to know your reporting boundaries and what your personal government or company's retirement age policies say. And if it's a personal company policy and they have no specifications, you'll need to work with HR to get them to actually nail down a policy that is clear for people. Anyone else? We've got a couple of minutes left. I can see in chat that one company, they used MF or X. They used the forms with inclusive language, and the X was sent out to state as other. Yeah, so that matches with suggesting that you use sensitive language to people and that you make sure that you specify if things are going to be lumped into other, that these particular gender identities will be lumped into other, because it's possible that someone would say, I am not an other, I'm female, whereas perhaps they might have previously put trans woman, and that might have been lumped into other. It would depend on where the company drew the line. So explaining where your line is drawn is always a wise choice to make sure that the most accurate data gets collected and that people have their data and their preferences treated with respect. And I see a note, Beck Bailey from HRC has been monitoring the chat and answering questions in there for me while I've been talking and having to flip through the slides and not seeing everything. So I'm going to have to look through the chat afterwards and see their answers. But thank you, Beck Bailey. I appreciate you helping out. And I'm also very sorry to the person who ended up on a breakout room on them by themselves. I'm sorry you missed out on discussion time and that there was no way to get back into or join one of the other rooms. If there's no more feedback, thank you everyone for coming. If anyone does want to talk privately, my profile is up on the presenters page on the Out and Equal website, and that's got my company email address, but it's fiona.nowling@mckesson.com. And Fiona is F for Foxtrot, I-O-N-A, and then Nowling is N for November, O-W-L-I-N-G. And you can also download a copy of this slide presentation, which will have the correct spelling as well, so it'll be easy to find me, and with the correct spelling from McKesson too. But thank you everyone for coming.